Picture a hunter somewhere in southern Africa approximately 70,000 years ago. He has been tracking a medium-sized antelope for the better part of a morning. The animal is not wounded, not exhausted, not separated from its herd by any fortunate circumstance. It is alert, healthy, and standing about 40 meters away at the edge of a dry riverbed. Its nose working the air, ears rotating independently the way antelope ears do when something in the environment has registered as wrong without yet triggering full flight. 40 meters. The hunter knows this distance the way anyone knows a number they have worked with every day for years. At 40 meters with a hand-thrown spear, the hit probability drops to something uncomfortable. The animal would need to be stationary, which it is right now but will not be in a few seconds. The throw arc is visible. Antelope have been reading the arc of thrown objects since before any human threw one. The moment the arm cocks back, the animal is already processing the threat and calculating its departure. And then the hunter raises something that is not a spear, a stick bent into a curve by the tension of a cord strung between its two ends. A second, much shorter stick rested against the cord, its back end notched to grip the string. He draws the cord back. The short stick bends with the pressure. The system stores energy in the bent wood and the stretched cord simultaneously. He releases. The short stick crosses 40 meters in less than a second. The antelope does not have time to complete its flight calculation. The projectile arrives before the animal's nervous system has finished processing the departure signal. This moment, this specific crossing of the threshold between thrown spear range and bow and arrow range, was arguably one of the most consequential technological transitions in all of human prehistory. Not because the bow and arrow was more lethal than previous weapons in an absolute sense, but because of what it changed about the relationship between human hunters and everything they hunted. A weapon that could be deployed accurately at distances greater than the animal's flight response time was not just a better spear. It was a different category of weapon entirely. It changed the ecological position of the human hunter in ways that rippled through everything. Prey-animal behavior, human group hunting strategies, population spread, territorial competition, and ultimately the demographic and ecological history of the entire planet. And nobody invented it. That is the important thing to understand first. The bow and arrow was not invented. It was accumulated, assembled over thousands of years from prior technologies, prior observations, and prior cognitive frameworks in a process that looked nothing like the eureka moment that the word invention implies, and everything like the slow, generational, mostly invisible accumulation of incremental improvements that characterizes almost every major technology in human history. Understanding how ancient humans actually arrived at the bow and arrow requires understanding that trajectory, where the components came from, what cognitive prerequisites were necessary, what ecological pressures made the development valuable enough to sustain the long process of refinement, and why the bow and arrow appeared when it did, rather than earlier or later. Start with the oldest evidence, because the question of when the bow and arrow was first used has been one of the most actively revised topics in prehistoric technology research. For most of the 20th century, the bow and arrow was believed to be a relatively recent invention, appearing in the archaeological record of Europe approximately 10 to 15,000 years ago and spreading from there. This timing placed the bow and arrow in the late Upper Paleolithic or early Mesolithic and suggested it was one of many technological innovations of the period following the last glacial maximum. The evidence from European sites, small, symmetrical flint points of the appropriate size and shape for arrows, with edgeware patterns consistent with arrow shaft attachment, was reasonably clear and reasonably dated. Then the Sibudu cave site in South Africa produced evidence that changed the timeline dramatically. Analysis of small stone points from Sibudu cave, dating to approximately 64,000 years ago, found traces of blood, plant residue, and adhesive compounds on the points in patterns consistent with hafted arrowheads, rather than handheld or spear-attached points. The points themselves are too small and too symmetrical to be effective spearheads, but fall within the size range of arrow points from other sites with clearer bow and arrow context. Additional South African sites have produced comparable evidence, and some researchers argue that Still Bay and Howison's port tool industries, appearing in the South African archaeological record between approximately 70 and 100,000 years ago, include arrow points among their characteristic small symmetric tools. If this interpretation is correct, the bow and arrow was not a late Paleolithic innovation, but a Middle Stone Age technology developed in Africa tens of thousands of years before it appears in the European record. The dating question matters enormously for understanding the developmental story because it changes what human cognitive and social context the technology was developed within. A bow and arrow appearing 64,000 years ago in southern Africa was developed by populations who were already producing complex ochre engravings, collecting shell ornaments, using compound adhesives, and showing a range of behavioral complexity that researchers associate with fully modern human cognition. This is not a simple weapon developed by cognitively limited people. It is a sophisticated compound technology requiring multiple separately produced components assembled through multi-step processes, developed by people with the full cognitive toolkit of modern humans. The cognitive prerequisites for bow and arrow development are worth examining in detail because they illuminate why the technology did not appear earlier in human history, despite the component materials being available essentially wherever humans lived. The bow is a spring, a device for storing mechanical energy in elastic deformation and releasing it rapidly into a projectile. The principle requires no explicit understanding of physics, but recognizing that a bent stick returns to its original shape, with force requires observation, and recognizing that this return force could be harnessed to accelerate a projectile requires the kind of causal reasoning about physical systems that developmental psychologists associate with mature human cognition. The insight is not obvious. There is no reason a person who had never seen a bow to spontaneously recognize that the elastic property of bent wood is something useful for projectile acceleration rather than simply a property of wood that makes it springy. The bowstring is equally non-obvious. Plant fibers, animal sinew, and rawhide all have appropriate properties for bowstrings. But recognizing this requires connecting the property of tensile strength in these materials to the mechanical requirement of the bow system. The bowstring must be the right length, short enough to maintain bow tension, but not so short it overbends the bow, and attached to the bow in a way that maintains the tension across the length of the limb without slipping or breaking. The arrow requires its own set of cognitive achievements. The shaft must be straight. Deviation from straightness creates aerodynamic instability that destroys accuracy. Straightening a wooden shaft requires controlled application of heat and pressure, testing for deviation, and iterative correction. A process that requires both the technique knowledge and the patience to apply it systematically. The notch at the rear of the arrow that grips the bowstring, must be at a consistent angle relative to the fletching and point for stable flight. The fletching itself, the feathers or other stabilizers at the arrow's rear, must be attached at the correct angle to impart the rotational stability that improves accuracy. The arrowhead must be light enough to be carried effectively by the shaft, but dense enough and sharp enough to penetrate prey effectively. It must be attached hafted, in a way that keeps it aligned with the shaft during flight and securely attached during impact without being so rigid that it cannot be removed after a kill. The adhesives and binding materials used for hafting must be appropriate for the forces involved and durable enough to survive field use. Each of these component requirements is a problem that requires a solution, and none of the solutions are obvious in the sense that an untrained person encountering the materials for the first time would recognize the requirement or the solution. This is accumulated craft knowledge, knowledge that builds through observation, experimentation, failure, and incremental improvement across multiple generations of practitioners. The developmental pathway that led to the bow and arrow almost certainly ran through prior projectile technologies that provided the component knowledge base from which the bow system could be assembled. The throwing spear is the obvious prior technology, and its descendants provide the crucial intermediate step. The spear thrower, also called an atlatl. The atlatl is a handheld device, essentially a stick with a hook at one end, that functions as an extension of the throwing arm, increasing the effective lever arm. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. And therefore the velocity imparted to a thrown dart or light spear. Atlatl darts are shorter and lighter than hand-thrown spears, requiring the development of lighter, more aerodynamically refined projectile technology. The experience of producing and using atlatl darts, developing the knowledge of appropriate shaft materials, appropriate weights and dimensions, appropriate fletching for stability, and appropriate point hafting, provided much of the technological and cognitive framework that arrow production requires. The progression from hand-thrown spear to atlatl dart to arrow is not a simple linear sequence, and these technologies overlapped in time and coexisted for extended periods. But the knowledge accumulated through atlatl technology, how to produce light, straight shafts, how to attach points durably to thin shafts, how to use fletching for flight stability, how to balance the front and rear weight of a projectile for stable aerodynamics, directly transferred to arrow production. The bow itself was a different energy storage system, but the projectile that the bow launched was the technological descendant of the atlatl dart, not a completely novel development. The specific materials that arrows and bows are made from varied enormously across the geographic range where bow technology developed and spread, reflecting the materials available in different environments and the local craft knowledge developed for working those materials. Bow staves in different traditions used different woods. Yew, in European traditions for its combination of elastic wood in the sapwood, and compression-resistant heartwood. Osage orange in North American traditions, bamboo laminated with horn and sinew in Asian traditions. Each choice reflected both local material availability and accumulated craft knowledge about which materials had appropriate elastic and strength properties. The transition to composite bow construction, bows built from multiple materials laminated together, represents a major engineering advancement that appeared in Central Asia and spread across Eurasia. Composite bows combine a core material with backing material in tension and belly material in compression, engineering the bow to exploit the specific mechanical properties of each material rather than relying on a single material to provide all required properties. Sinew backing on the tension side of the bow increases energy storage without increasing the risk of limb failure. Horn on the compression belly side provides superior compression resistance compared to wood. The resulting composite bow stores more energy per unit of limb length and releases it more efficiently than a simple self-bow of the same length. Composite bow development required understanding, empirically if not theoretically, how different materials behaved under the specific mechanical conditions of bow use, and how laminating materials with complementary properties could produce a system superior to any of the component materials alone. This represents engineering sophistication that is often underappreciated when discussing ancient technology. The recognition that system properties can exceed component properties when materials are combined appropriately. The ecological pressures that made bow and arrow development valuable, the selection pressure that drove the sustained investment of craft effort and knowledge accumulation that the technology required, were the same pressures that had driven the development of every prior projectile technology. The fundamental challenge of getting close enough to dangerous or wary prey to make a kill. Large prey animals are dangerous at close range. An adult buffalo, elk, or bison is capable of killing a human hunter who has made a close-range killing attempt with a handheld weapon. The animals that survived millions of years of predation pressure evolved behavioral and physical defenses, flight response at distance, defensive aggression at close range, herd behavior that makes individual separation difficult, that made close-range hunting consistently costly in terms of hunter injury and mortality. Every meter of additional effective range that weapon technology provided was a reduction in the risk that the hunting encounter imposed on the hunter. A spear effective at 5 meters was a profound improvement over a handheld weapon requiring physical contact. An atlatl dart effective at 20 meters was a further improvement. A bow effective at 40 or 50 meters represented a qualitative shift, placing the hunter beyond the flight reaction distance of many prey species under favorable conditions, and certainly beyond the effective defensive response distance of most prey. The behavioral change in prey animals in response to bow and arrow predation is visible in the ethnographic and archaeological record. Prey populations that had been exposed to bow and arrow hunters for many generations showed elevated flight distances from human hunters compared to populations with no bow and arrow exposure history. The same evolutionary pressure toward wariness that we observe in continental African megafauna that co-evolved with human hunters over millions of years compressed into culturally transmitted behavioral change in the prey populations that encountered bow hunters for the first time. The bow and arrow's range advantage also transformed human territorial and interpersonal conflict. Distance warfare, engaging opponents at ranges where hand weapons are ineffective, became possible with reliable projectile weapons that could be aimed and released in the time it took an opponent to close from 40 meters to hand range. The tactical implications transformed how human groups organized conflict, how they defended territory, and how they assessed the offensive and defensive capabilities of other groups they encountered. Archaeological evidence for bow and arrow warfare is visible in skeletal assemblages from various periods and regions. Individuals with embedded arrow points, individuals with arrow wound healed bone injuries, mass burial sites with evidence of projectile trauma. The Crow Creek massacre site in South Dakota, dated to approximately 1325 CE, contains the remains of approximately 500 individuals showing evidence of violent death, including arrow wounds. Evidence for the lethal potential of organized bow warfare at a scale that illuminates why this technology became central to human conflict. The transmission of bow and arrow technology, how the knowledge spread from its origins to cover most of the human world, followed the same pathways that all technology transmission follows. Migration of populations carrying the technology, trade networks through which technological knowledge traveled alongside material goods, and direct contact between adjacent groups that allowed observation and adoption. The spread of bow technology across Eurasia appears to have been relatively rapid once initiated, suggesting that wherever populations encountered the technology, its advantages were immediately obvious, and adoption was rapid. The cognitive and craft prerequisites for arrow production, the ability to work wood, attach points, prepare sinew, were already present in populations using prior projectile technologies, meaning that adopting bow technology did not require developing entirely new skill sets, but rather assembling existing skills in a new configuration. The adoption of bow technology by populations who had previously used only throwing weapons is documented in multiple archaeological contexts by the appearance of arrow points, typically smaller and more symmetric than throwing spear points, in assemblages that previously contained only larger points. This transition is visible in multiple world regions and provides one of the clearest examples in the archaeological record of technology adoption events that can be traced at reasonable temporal resolution. The arrow point itself, the stone tip attached to the arrow shaft, is the component of bow and arrow technology most extensively studied by archaeologists, because stone points preserve in the archaeological record long after the organic components of the bow system have decomposed. The typological diversity of arrow points across time and space is extraordinary. Thousands of distinct point forms have been classified across different regions and periods, each reflecting local craft traditions, local material availability, and local functional requirements. The reduction in point size over time in many traditions, from the larger points of early projectile systems to the microlithic points of mature arrow traditions, reflects both functional optimization and craft sophistication. Smaller points are lighter, reducing the arrow's front weight and allowing better aerodynamic balance. Smaller points require less raw material, important in regions where high-quality napping stone was scarce. Smaller points can be produced more rapidly by skilled nappers, allowing faster replacement of lost or broken points. And smaller points, when attached correctly to arrow shafts, are fully effective at penetrating prey despite their reduced size. The microlithic revolution, the appearance of very small, geometrically regular stone points in many traditions across Africa, Europe, and Asia, represents the mature expression of aerotechnology's functional requirements in the knapping craft. The geometric regularity of microliths, trapezoids, triangles, crescents, reflects both the standardization that characterizes mature craft traditions and the specific aerodynamic and attachment requirements that arrow tips must meet for reliable performance. The cognitive trajectory that runs from the first thrown stone to the composite recurve bow of the Central Asian steppe, spanning perhaps 2 million years of increasingly sophisticated projectile development, is one of the clearest illustrations available of how human technological development actually works. Not through individual genius moments of invention, but through the slow accumulation of component knowledge, the incremental improvement of existing systems, the transmission of craft knowledge across generations, and the occasional synthesis event when existing knowledge components combine into a system whose capabilities exceed any of the parts. The hunter at the beginning of this account, raising a bow at a nervous antelope 40 meters away, was not executing an invention. He was the beneficiary of an accumulated craft tradition that stretched back through his teachers and their teachers and generations of teachers before them, each of whom had learned from observation and practice and had passed on what they learned in the same way. The knowledge in his hands was older than his memory, older than his community's memory, built from observations and refinements that nobody had recorded and nobody could trace to an origin. The antelope was still standing when the arrow was released. It was falling when the echo of the release had barely faded. The technology worked. It had been refined for long enough that it could not do otherwise. And somewhere, in another camp, in another landscape, another person was watching an older relative demonstrate the technique for producing a straight shaft. How to hold the wood near the fire without burning it. How to feel the wood change under the heat, how to apply pressure in exactly the right direction to bring the shaft into true alignment. The bow and arrow was not invented by anyone, it was inherited by everyone. That is how most of the things that matter actually get made.